Coming next on Landscapes Through Time, artist David Dunlop travels to Venice to explore the expressive paintings of Francesco Guardi.
Venice, for 1,000 years, a serene republic, floating with art and architecture until 1797, when Napoleon marches in, steals the independence, and whatever else he wants. It was his way. Venice had made artists famous, and artists had made Venice memorable. In the 18th century, the most famous landscape painter here was Canaletto, the most famous artist, Tiepolo. So why would the 20th century, all the way through into the first decades of the 21st century, be more interested in the imagination and the works of Francesco Guardi? Like Van Gogh, Guardi was an artist ahead of his time. He was largely forgotten in the 19th century, but today he's a hero of expressionists, of personal points of view, of invention. I'm David Dunlop. I'm a landscape painter. I'm going to set up my easel where Francesco Guardi set up his. We're going to look through Francesco Guardi's 18th century eyes, put ourselves in the Piazza San Marco, take a look at his home district, the Cannaregio, and see how he transformed his impressions into paint, transmuted his experience into his emotional, expressive paintings with a personal vision, a quirkiness, a sense of reinvention unlike any other artist of the 18th century, here in Venice. Like so many Venetian artists, Francesco Guardi comes from a family of painters. His father was a painter. His brother Antonio was a painter. His son Giacomo will become an artist as well. In fact, Francesco Guardi's sister Cecilia was the wife of Tiepolo. We believe today that he was apprenticed to his brother Antonio, who was a figure painter, a Rococo-style figure painter. And it's that Rococo style that we're going to see made more inventive and fanciful in the work of Guardi. The Guardi workshop painted altarpieces, portraits, and copies of masterpieces. Guardi was an artist who really paints in three different directions. He paints completely invented landscapes, called the Capriccio. He also paints interiors and celebration scenes of Venice. And he paints the landscapes. The landscapes you see here. Francesco Guardi comes late to landscape painting. We suspect it was in his 40s, and a market was developing for landscape painting. There was no war. Guardi's and Canaletto's paintings of this cityscape were works made in search of a new market with a new subject. No longer was the client the church. Now they were wealthy tourists on the grand tour. This is the Piazza San Marco, in the heart of Venice, in its most famous public space. This is the seat of the power to control the empire of Venice, which reaches across the eastern Mediterranean. For centuries, we're almost talking about a 1,000-year epoch. And inside of this space, at the far end, is the ancient Byzantine Church of San Marco. The connection between the east and the west, St. Mark, the patron saint of Venice, with his symbol, the lion. And the artists who were indigenous to this place, like Canaletto, Guardi, Marieschi, Ricci, all of those artists know that if you're living in London and you're an aristocrat, you're going to want a souvenir. And that souvenir is this view. Because this town in the mid-18th century was the Las Vegas of Europe. And so it was a party atmosphere. With all of the pageantry, with all of the festivals, it had licensed casinos, thousands of courtesans employed here in Venice for the entertainment of visitors. After all, this had been a tourist attraction for a long time, and the visitors were always the aristocrats and the wealthy. It took a lot to get here. Artists would wander about Venice in front of the major monuments, part of the menu for the veduti of the 1700s, and position themselves for sketches and setting up their camera obscuras in those piazzas, like this. This is the piazza for Santa Maria della Salute, with a big view of the entrance to the Grand Canal. This noble church was dedicated in 1630 because Venice had survived the plague. The grateful city builds this marvelous Baroque cathedral. So outside we have the great sculpture, the great architecture, Baldassare Longhena. Inside, we have the great artists, Titians, Tintorettos, and it would be a perfect place for Francesco Guardi to set up and do a preliminary study before beginning a painting, some just for themselves. Guardi will do many drawings, and they're just ink washes with pen and ink and graphite. Many of the artists of this period would be relying on a camera obscura machine, looking into the machine and tracing the drawing like tracing a photograph, but this is before photography, so there's no film, but they would be tracing the reflected image through the lens. So the process would be first the graphite, then some ink with a steel point or a croquill pen, a broken line with some nervous wiggle, the sense of fun, because that's what Guardi was known for. He's using personal gestures in the sense of calligraphy. He's a linear perspective expert, as all of the artists of this period are. The whole process will not take him very long, and some of the feeling of detail will come through the washes. I take the ink that I've been using, and I would dilute it with water, and I would have one just be very pale, like that, or a darker solution for the deeper shadow. And this is going down like a watercolor. In this city, everybody knew everybody. Casanova himself writes about a dinner with his brother Antonio and talks about Francesco Guardi. Francesco Guardi will do many of these in a day, and he's doing them until his 81st year, the year of his death. Whether it's here at Maria della Salute or in his own home district, the Cannaregio. In the middle of the 1700s, Francesco Guardi and Canaletto are both elected to a new Academy of Painters. He's able to get a number of commissions, one from Pietro Edwards and one for the Bucentoro series. This city, Venice, is so dependent upon water. Its identity, its soul, and its relation to nature come via the water. There's an annual festival called the Festa della Senza, where they take the Doge and their most decorated ships, the Bucentoro. They head out into the bacino at San Marco and re-establish their vows with the sea. They actually sacrifice gold rings to the sea as a symbol of this marriage to the sea. Guardi is employed to show us that pageantry, but he'd also be keeping afloat the myth of Venice, the myth of the Serene Republic. While this is the Grand Canal, that is the river of the district of Cannaregio, the home district of Francesco Guardi. Marieschi, Canaletto, many other artists made sketches, drawings, and maybe even paintings here. So we're going to explore the methods and the palette and the points of view of Francesco Guardi. They begin with an iron oxide like burnt sienna. And then the paintings begin through a process of layering. There usually, for them, would be a drawing underneath the painting. The water would be low. My sight line is just above the water. It's my eye level. First layer of windows, the vanishing point on the sight line, and I just start drawing linear perspective lines, we call these recessionals, to this central vanishing point. And the tops of the buildings will have an asymmetrical triangle, and to avoid the middles. The tower, our tallest feature, I can see how my buildings, parallel lines, are going to converge to this central vanishing point to help give that sense of deep space. I want to keep this dome lower than this tower. Guardi is not going to be faithful to the building's location or shape. He's going to design a picture that is for him emotionally persuasive, which is different than architecturally or geographically accurate. His palette is pretty simple and limited. The iron oxide is right here, that's the brown, that's the burnt sienna base, ultramarine blue, an azurite, white, a vermilion, which was available then, and a yellow. And I'm going to put a little bit of walnut oil on my brush first. Now I'm going to reach in here and pick up some of this iron oxide and smear it across the drawing. The graphite will dissolve into the paint. And it's the same subtone we'll find in almost all of the Venetian landscape painters. In fact, English painters, Italian landscape painters in general, in the 1700s, would be using this color underneath. The other ingredient that could be used is, we still call it Venetian turpentine. Now I'm going to lift some of that up so that it won't pollute the colors that I put on top. If you're working layer by layer and letting them dry in your studio, you don't have to do that. You can just do this, let it dry, and once the painting is dry, it's more receptive to adding the glazing. In our situation here, we're doing this alla prima, all at once. You start to see the silhouette of the city as we find a dome which was not there in Francesco Guardi's time. It's been added since. So we can go into the scene using linear perspective. The smaller things are, as he knew, with linear perspective, the farther away they appear. And we just get big shapes locked in place. Now, to find a higher degree of contrast, he could mix in some blacks, or he could take some blue into his brown. This gives it a greenish tone, and his paintings are known for some of that blue-greenish cast. And I'm now just drawing some vertical lines down to put in some shadowed areas, which are fast changing because light is that way. It's ephemeral. He has an understory which is more stained than the upper stories, which you see here. It's darker down in here. The rest is quite washed in light at this time of day. I'm going to increase the contrast, and I'm doing that by removing some of the paint with oil on my finger. We've been finger painting a long time, and we'll go through what he will do himself, light and dark territories. Now let's apply some of that blue. I take some white and mix it with this color and a little bit of red to give it a bit of grayed blue violet touch. And I'm going to cut a silhouette of the city again, just as I did by wiping out earlier. And I'll probably go even a little deeper so that the saturation is darker. And we're just getting contrast. We're not going to put any figures or dancing in yet because that happens as he works into the paint. Now, all of those painters, whether you're Canaletto or whether you're even Leonardo da Vinci, are obligated to paint and decorate ceilings, walls, do evening entertainment decorations, theater pieces. In fact, Kenneth Clark believes that landscape painting is born right here in Venice, and it is an outgrowth of the theater sets that were so common here for so many centuries. I'll go over here with something a little darker. He's the one who likes drama. He's been looking at Giorgione's Tempest, which today is over in the museum here in Venice. And to really frame it like a Venetian stage set, you would have curtains left and right of the picture to get you to move into this territory of the painting. And again, the greater the contrast, the greater the drama. Now that's going to have a little bit of its reflection, but he goes pretty green usually down here. Mix this brown with this blue, and you get the water of the Grand Canal. And what Guardi's going to do is put an even deeper value down in here as a darker territory of water will help him hold on to this threshold of dark that's at the bottom. I'm going to mix more white and that same azurite blue, not the expensive ultramarine, and start to build up some sky. I'm going to lift some of that paint off too, right now, as we get a little more turbulent sky. So the skies are theatrical skies, like Tiepolo's, like Piazzetta's. And lift some of that light out of the water, as he also tries to get effects from his touches of texture and lifts off the paint to reveal some light. He will also be adding it. So it's a give and take. Add, subtract, add, subtract. Later it will be mostly glazes. I can move to a slightly smaller brush. More turbulence in color and effect. And this sort of sky with so much motion and excitement is a sky that's typical of Guardi. And all of this swirling, it's kind of a Rococo effect. I can take some of the colors I've put into the water and put them up on the building. And try to find the building in terms of its shadows. I'm going to mix that yellow-green with the red and make it a little orange. and pull ourselves back into that space with some bands of light and dark. Of course, one of the joys of Venice are domes and towers. Now, the scholarship over the past 100 years has changed on Francesco Guardi. 100 years ago, if you had asked any scholar, they would have said that Guardi apprenticed with Canaletto. Today, not so. Guardi, we know, worked in his brother's Rococo workshop. They worked jointly on projects and maybe with Marieschi in his studio and with other painters. Throughout his life, Guardi, like artists from Titian to Van Gogh, used the compositions of other painters, including Canaletto, changing them with his singular style. Art was a business. The Guardi family workshop struggled for revenue. Without a demand for signature works like Canaletto's workshop, they sought whatever they could get, portraits, altarpieces, and copies. This is a universal experience of struggling artists across time. Take the work that pays. Perhaps this absence of pressure for signature works, like Canaletto, allowed Guardi more freedom, leaving him free to explore more emotional and expressive painting, and less encumbered by the constraints of the fashionable neoclassical painting. Like Guardi, I'm segmenting the turn. Even in working on this picture, I can see how Guardi had in mind the paintings of Giorgione or Titian, because you can feel that sense of drama that he's inherited from the 16th century. But during his lifetime, Guardi's paintings sold for only a fraction of a Canaletto. And generally, Guardi's clients were not Canaletto's clients. Canaletto gives us a perfected Venice, a glossy illusion. Guardi reveals a lively Venice of raucous, decadent energy, of parties and casinos, of mystery and atmosphere and lagoon traffic that pulsed around him. Even his figures animate the atmosphere of Venice. You can push the sky to help you define the buildings and the shapes. And Guardi knew the advantage of visual noise as well. That is, make a visual texture and let people guess into it that it's something. It's how our brain works neurologically. It's perceptual psychology. That we manufacture detail. As Leonardo da Vinci said, to make detail is to hinder the experience of detail. So just do a lot of suggestion. Guardi was more persuaded of the value of ambiguity than, let's say, Canaletto. Ruled, taut lines, and linear sense of detail constrained the sense of emotion and rhythm in the picture. Because this painting is lopsided in balance in favor of this, I'm going to make this territory smaller so that we can subordinate this architecture over here, just as Francesco Guardi took the same kind of license. Now we'll go back to put in some sky and help find the outside edges. Now see how much more established the triangle is than it was a moment ago. Make this building shorter to make this one appear taller. There's a small courtyard which is right out in front, which will reflect light, so we have a light against a dark. Brightening down here. And again, anything light and dark back in here, so I have some variety. But remember, in all probability, Guardi's paintings were painted in the studio, so he uses a constant light. As with Canaletto, as with Guardi, as with all of these painters, a light touch allows them greater evocation of atmosphere, space, and varieties of texture on the faces of the buildings. Softer touch, more expression. And that touch that is light and figurative and expressive, a tocca, seems to be particularly Guardi's. He's using thinned color, transparent color with texture, so that the ground of the color that's underneath continues to show through. So the paintings seem to have a luminance. When you add more paint, you subtract more light. When you subtract paint, you add more light. This is such a different tradition than the fresco painting. What we're doing here in Venice is painting in olio, in oil, and olio sul tela, on linen. It was really pretty much an invention here in Venice, from canvas for the sails, from sailing ships. While all of the other artists are busy painting in calligraphic squiggles to represent the idea of wave, That's our icon for wave. It's a symbolic representation of what we think of as wave, which fits like this for water. Now, this calligraphy, Guardi painted this as well. But remember, he's an observer. He notices that the water has these transitions in value, that there is translucence, and that if he superimposes these little repetitive calligraphic notes, it makes the work less dramatic. So he dispenses with those little calligraphic light lines on top in the water and goes instead for something of a general mirror effect, which I'm going to do in just a second now. And as Guardi does, let the brush patterns themselves suggest the water rather than rely on the calligraphy of an added lettered stroke. So he's getting a transition from darker to lighter, which also brings you back in space. Before I start thinking of other things, I'm going to think about some of the qualities of reflection. You can do this by adding color, waiting for the paint to dry, or you can subtract the paint. So the echoes are reciprocal, they're vertical down into here. The one method is to just go ahead and continue to lift, and when I lift, I'll mix some of the color that is already down. Now the reflection is never going to be as strong as the color above it. It's always weakened, because what's happened is this catches the original light, this is the reflected light, and the reflected light is never as intense a color, the darks aren't as dark and the lights aren't as light. That's an observation Francesco Guardi had made in the 1700s. As in the time of Francesco Guardi, gondolas. Now annually, there is a race of the gondolas. Each community sends their best and compete, kind of like the Palio in Siena with the horse race. And he lets them disguise themselves in the shadows of the foreground. I'm going to start darker, just to put some element to hold the attention on down here, as he did with the gondolas of his time, which all were hooded and covered in a way that we don't see much today. Because this is darker, I'll go in with this and help shape the top cupola. Naturally, there's more activity that piles up with smaller craft in his time as in ours. Just to put some confusion into the scene. And again, he's pushing contrast. I have to remember to push contrast, because that's where drama lies. Anytime you exaggerate the contrast, you exaggerate simultaneously the drama. I come into this yellow, remember to make it a little bit orange, because he did not have this pure of a yellow. And then to keep it thin, so the light keeps coming through the color, I keep adding the terp to the color. Add some more of those reflections in here to again draw your eye back into that kind of space. And by the time we get to Turner, we really have some pretty liberated reflections. This reference of the reflection back to the object helps repeat the idea that it really is a floating city. So I don't want to make any of these static. I want them to wiggle, I want them to blur, I want them to have some sense of motion and chaos. I'm just still revealing light, just different sparkles of light, so that we go from a dark to a light to a dark to a light. And that was the idea for Guardi, because he knows the darker I make any territory, the brighter the building becomes. The sharper I incline it, the more we're aware of it. If I want to make it stronger, I just make the territory next to it darker versus lighter. I'll do it here too. You see how it helps propel the buildings? And that's Guardi-esque. Do you notice I went from a 2-inch to a 1-inch and now to a round? This is Guardi's round, which he treats like he does the pen. And what he does is, he learns to add this kind of calligraphy, but in shadow notes or in bright notes, onto the painting itself. You see how the linear aspect of this is beginning to have some replication with the pen and ink work. And at any point, he's able to go back and find and scrub out something that gives him a little more of that sense of drama that the light and dark, the chiaroscuro effect, will afford him. In the period of time I've had now, I've had just enough to be able to give you, I think, some feeling for this process. I'm not looking to replicate the process, the palette perhaps, and the perspective system that he uses, but I would need to be doing this in a studio to really give you the full effect, especially of the figures or the glazing. But let's pull the tape off now and see where we are. Okay, here we go. Francesco Guardi is an artist who had a personal vision, who could bring his emotion and his passion and transmute his feelings into paint. The subject is Venice, but he is giving you a sensation, a feeling, an energy. That's the legacy, that's the gift he gives to you and me. I'm David Dunlop, I'm a landscape painter.
Funding for this program was made possible by the following. On the next Landscapes Through Time, artist David Dunlop travels to Venice to discover the dazzling watercolors of John Singer Sargent.